Sally Haslanger is Ford Professor of Philosophy and Women's Studies I did this by memory, I hope I didn't make any mistakes, and Women's Studies in the Department of Philosophy of Linguistics at MIT. If you, as you certainly know, if you're lucky enough to have spent any time with Sally, she is one of the wisest, warmest, funniest, and most passionate and intellectually curious people that you'll ever meet. Her work has incredible range. She's done groundbreaking work on basic issues in metaphysics, including theories of persistence and identity. She's helped clarify the notion of social construction and brought it to the center of analytic philosophy. She's worked on the nature of race and gender, has introduced the idea of ameliorative conceptual analysis, which has sparked whole subfields now, and has done fundamental work in the philosophy of language and other areas. Most of all, she's a role model for me and so many others, and I can't imagine a better person to kick off this conference, so I'm honored to introduce Sally Haslanger.
Thank you all. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, David. Thank you, Kurt, everybody. Also, thanks to all the child care providers who have made it possible for you to be here if you have children. Thank you to the dog watchers, to all of the other support systems that we rely on, which is part of the social world. I need a handout too. Work is often invisible, and we should pay attention to it. So the way I do my talks is I have a very elaborate and long-winded handout, and I read some and I talk some, and I do this for multiple reasons. One is an issue of accessibility. So not everyone is equally fluent in English, and English is hegemonic in this field, and I think that is a shame because it makes it a good philosophy sometimes unavailable to people who aren't fluent, and so this is an aid. Also, I think we presuppose that people are very good at processing information orally, but not everybody is, and so this is also a way to try to right some of the imbalances that are due to disability. Anyway, it's also a party favor. So I'm very interested in your feedback and your engagement, and I think sometimes this gives you better resources to challenge what I'm saying and have me think differently. So it's a great honor to be here and be the first presenter. I think that one reason maybe Brian wanted me to be in this position was because of the goals of the conference. He thought maybe it would be possible for me to talk to many different constituencies who are here. So for example, I'll talk to the critical theorists, and I'll talk to the people who are doing philosophy of language a little bit, and talk to the people doing race and gender. And there's great opportunities here to try and build some of those connections across these somewhat balkanized subfields. There, of course, is a risk that, well, it's not a risk that I'm doing too much. I am certainly doing too much. But there's a risk that it won't hang together and everybody will go, whoa, she just said this much that was interesting, and the rest is, whoa, who knows what she's talking about. So I'm going to try and weave together some themes and see if it works. Okay, here we go. So section 1, ideal theory. So in social political philosophy, there has been an ongoing debate about the value of ideal theory. And the debate tends to focus on two questions. First, should philosophical inquiry begin by considering idealized cases, selecting and abstracting from the concrete phenomena which prompt our inquiry? Second, should philosophers aim to capture a normative ideal toward which we should be aiming in rectifying past and current wrongs? Now, sometimes these two questions interact. For example, if one assumes that the ideal can be discovered only by considering idealized cases. For example, ideal theorists in political theory argue that we need to know what justice is in order to remedy current injustice. And I'm going to call this, following Mari Mikkola, the normative priority thesis. So you need to understand what the ideal is in order to make progress in everyday life. And in order to know what justice is, we must abstract away from the messy reality of our lives and understand justice through reflection on idealized cases. And so, again, following Mikkola, called this the distancing thesis. Adam Swift puts it succinctly: only by reference to philosophy, abstract, pure, context-free philosophy, can we have an adequate basis for thinking how to promote justice in our current radically non-ideal circumstances. So in recent years, the issue of ideal theory has also been raised in other philosophical domains as well. Should we study cooperative versus uncooperative communication? Should we study knowledge or ignorance? And the answer has increasingly been no, or not always, at least in my little balkanized area of philosophy, no. Okay, so in the context of social ontology, one might think that we can set aside question 2, should we aim to capture a normative ideal? For we aren't engaged in normative inquiry. However, I don't really think that's true. Social ontology is an essential part of normative inquiry, both moral and epistemic. And as I see it, normative inquiry frames crucial questions in social ontology. So social ontology cannot be easily separated from normative questions, or so I say, and I'll talk about this more as we go on. So should we pursue ideal social ontology, or should we pursue non-ideal social ontology? How do we want to go about addressing 1 and 2? Now, to give you a broad answer, I think let many flowers bloom, right? I'm not going to say ideal theory is a terrible thing. I'm not going to say that, I myself prefer non-ideal theory. And so part of my job here is to try and introduce some of you to what non-ideal social ontology might look like. But I'm not saying everybody's got to do it. Again, let many flowers bloom. Okay, so historically, these are now some of the worries about ideal theory. The method of analytic philosophy urges us to begin with clear and simple cases and builds up from there. Here's some general worries about that. First, the chosen cases are often not the central phenomena to be understood. Complex and important phenomena are ignored or downgraded, or we'll handle that when we've got the rest of it worked out, right? Like never. The selection of cases is often biased towards ones that particularly socially situated dominant inquirers find compelling or familiar. So as is often noticed in political philosophy, not a lot of time is spent on care work, right? And in the social sciences, when you talk about work, reproductive labor, not part of the story, right? So that might be because who's doing the work. The tools we develop to handle the chosen cases cannot simply be expanded or permuted to understand the phenomenon as a whole, though that's assumed because we never get to the ones that are the kind of more derivative or marginal cases. They're like pushed way down the road, so we don't have any sense of how limited our resources are. And also, in my view, it seems methodologically questionable to develop theory using a priori methods about idealized cases and then think that it can address actual cases if we add the empirical details. So like all we need to do applied ethics is take deontology or utilitarianism and add some empirical facts. That solves our problems. Not ever. Okay. So it doesn't follow from these concerns, I want to emphasize, that idealization or abstraction is problematic in itself. I don't think it does. They do show that idealization and abstraction can be quite risky. I think that idealization and abstraction are, to some extent, inevitable in theorizing because we're looking for patterns. And the minute you try and look for patterns, you want to kind of abstract off of the particularity of each thing, right? You want to find what they have in common. But the main issue is how to determine what details are and aren't relevant. Inquiry, as I understand it, begins with a question, and the first task is to clarify the question. Considering patterns in infant care, for example, we might ask, why did Lisa quit her job when she had Lulu? I've talked about this in a paper on structural explanation, but it's useful as a way to get on the table how complex it is even to understand the nature of the questions that we're asking. Now, we're supposed to be looking at patterns, and Lisa is a paradigmatic example. She might even be a thought experiment. And we say, why did Lisa quit her job when she had Lulu? But the question can be expanded in various ways. For example, why did Lisa versus her husband Larry quit their job? In families where one parent quits their job, why is it mostly mothers versus fathers? Or we could say, why did Lisa quit her job versus taking paid maternity leave? In families where one parent quits their job, why do they quit rather than take maternity leave? Now notice these two sets of questions are quite different, and what's going to be relevant in considering the cases will differ depending on how we spell out the question. So my point here is simply that there are going to be questions that we ask that we think are clear enough, but there's all kinds of background presuppositions that we are bringing to the situation. What's the relevant contracts class? How are we going to decide which is the focus of the question, et cetera. So what possible and actual scenarios are relevant to consider depends on what we want to know and for what purposes. So I'm not saying that this is a particular theory of inquiry and of explanation, that I'm saying it as if I'm just giving you the facts. I am well aware that this is not, uncontroversial, but it's my approach to how we think about theorizing, how we think about questions. So ontological questions are often posed in a way that I think obscures what's at issue. So if one asks, what is intrinsicness, or what is metaphysical dependence, my first impulse is to respond, what do you need it for? Right? Why do you want to know? What are you going to try and do with that tool? It's a conceptual tool. What do you need to do with it? And then we can begin to think about what the answer might be. In the context of social ontology, we ask, what is an institution? What is a social kind? And what is collective intentionality? Now, I think such questions can be addressed only against background presuppositions about what phenomena are legitimately considered paradigmatic of the phenomenon or pattern under consideration. What contrasts are at issue, like in the Lulu and Lisa case, and how the answer will fit into a broader theory, what our answers are to related questions. So we can't ask what is a social kind unless we say, well, social as opposed to what? Social as opposed to natural? No, because the notion of natural kind is very problematically situated in our history, right? And what we mean by a natural kind is very complicated. So we really need to sort out what the relevant contrasts are and why we're asking. Okay, so one set of legitimate questions concerns how we might solve a specific problem facing us. And this is where I'm working to try and dig down into what a non-ideal account might look like. So for example, how should we reform the educational system in Boston to be more fair? We know it's not fair. We know what happens to black students. We know what happens to poor students. We know what happens to disabled students. It's not fair. No educational system in the United States is fair. It's no surprise that the one in Boston isn't. But to solve such problems, I think idealized examples and ideal theory is neither necessary nor particularly useful. Here are some reasons why. We need to understand the complexity of the situation that faces us, and we have to draw on empirical inquiry to diagnose the problem. You're not going to be able to figure out why it's unfair by doing a priori inquiry around a seminar table, obviously, right? We don't need to know what the ideal is to make progress towards justice. We can do a lot of remediation without figuring out what the ideal is. And attempting to implement an ideal when the circumstances and agents are far from ideal is often a mistake. We might think, however, that it's not philosophy's job to answer such concrete questions, right? When is a philosopher, well, I think it's an interesting philosophical question about how we might make the Boston public schools more fair. I think it's something that philosophers should have something to say about. And if philosophy can't contribute to answering such questions, then the priority and distancing theses look very weak. So the priority said you have to have ideal theory in order to figure out how to change the world for the better. No. The distancing thesis, you've got to think about the abstract cases in order to solve the problems. Not so much. What we need to do is start from the particular problems in the circumstance. We can learn a lot about justice from considering concrete social circumstances, and I would argue that such bottom-up versus top-down theorizing is the best way to learn about justice. For our background presuppositions are tested against the messy reality that we're trying to address. So I do think that, we need to have some ideal stuff going on and some a priori reflection and that kind of stuff that can inform us. But I also do think that in order to understand what justice is, we do better by starting bottom up. rather than trying to go tell the people in the Boston Public Schools how to do deontology or whatever. Okay, so there is a form of theory, of ideal theory, I think, that has dominated work in social ontology. One form of it appears in idealizing assumptions about individuals. When we think of humans in the abstract, it's tempting to begin with a single person, say, consider a human being. Okay, we've considered a human being, it's a single individual. They have a body and a mind and are capable of using the mind to move the body to perform actions. Raise your hand. How many of you have, anyway, use that example. I raise my hand. Okay, so we're able to do that. Sometimes they interact with others. Maybe they even go for a walk together or paint a house together. But if we begin theory simply with a singleton agent with capacities for deliberative thought and agency, including motor skills to raise their hand, then very young children, some of the disabled and elderly, and non-human animals are left as afterthoughts. So just as I was talking about the idealized cases, the selection of cases that are the paradigm is highly political, I think. And to neglect the fact that there are core instances of human beings who can't raise their hands. There are core instances of human beings who can't communicate using language, etc. I think that this is problematic. Also, if the bodies and histories of the abstract agents are washed out as well, then reproductive and sexual differences, historical injustices, and material conditions are occluded. This isn't to say that we can't learn from philosophical exercises that focus on such idealized, abstract, able-bodied, male, white human beings. We've done pretty well using that as a starting point. But for many of us, it's unclear how to apply these lessons to the problems that motivate our inquiry, for we're not trying to understand how abstract humans might organize themselves. We want to solve problems that arise in our lives together here and now. Is social ontology relevant to improving the educational system in Boston? Is it relevant to understanding the racialization, gender binarism, and exploitation enacted there? I would hope so. I'm not sure it has always been so. So now I'm going to talk a bit about critical theory as a particular form of non-ideal theory. And I realize, because I'm a critical theorist, that's why I'm doing it, and I believe in critical theory. So critical theory is a form of non-ideal theory. It begins inquiry with questions arising in non-ideal circumstances and in resistance to injustice. So it's embedded. It's in that non-ideal space that's embedded. Typically, critical theory is invested in a particular social movement, like feminist movement, the anti-racist movement, disability movement. So critical theory begins there. Now, Frankfurt School critical theory is an even more specific version, for it takes the goal to provide a theory that is emancipatory. As Raymond Geuss puts it, to be more exact, a critical theory has as its inherent aim to be the self-consciousness of a successful process of enlightenment and emancipation. Now, this is really hard. Decades of work on, whoa, what does that mean? How can a theory be emancipatory? Blah, 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 blah. How is emancipatory theories different from merely scientific descriptive theories, right? I'm just glossing over the surface here, but I hopefully in a way that will be somewhat accessible. So how does a theory do that? What's its aim, really? Here's a little bit of my social ontology that I'm going to offer you to try and explain that. So we all participate in social structures and enact social practices that are unjust, but most of the time this is not obvious to us, even when we are the ones who are disadvantaged. We get up in the morning, try to get our kids to school, try to get to work on time. We don't think about the janitors who worked overnight. We don't think about the gender division of labor. We don't think about how the school is racializing our kids. We're just trying to get through the days, right? That's just, managing is hard enough. In ordinary life, our practices and our identities typically present themselves to us in ways that mask the broader system. Now, that's the way it's supposed to be, right? That's the way systems work. Fluency in a system is really a virtue of a system, that its participants are fluent in it. To explain our unthinking and often willing participation in oppressive structures, I think it's useful to have the concept of ideology. On my view, a cultural techne, this is the generic term because I use ideology in the pejorative sense. There are these two senses. I use it in the pejorative sense. A cultural techne is a set of social meanings, including concepts, scripts, background assumptions, which we might think of as analytic truths, inferential patterns, salient metaphors, metonyms, conceptual oppositions, and broadly speaking, grammar that provide tools for interpreting and responding to each other and the world around us, and does so in ways that facilitate better or worse forms of coordination. Think of you all coming in the room. I bet not a single one of you thought for a moment that you would come sit on the floor up here, or that you would stand at the desk, right? Why not? Why didn't you consider that? Why didn't you even have to deliberate about that? Because you're fluent in academic life. You have been brought up in academic life. You have patterns and habits and scripts and understandings that just move your body, right? Basically. There's a kind of, what we learn is a kind of grammar for social engagement in academic contexts. We have learned it. We come in and we see, oh, here's the lectern, there's the whatever, and I will just fit myself into it. It happens so easily. And this one, you might say, isn't such a bad one, right? Maybe it's a way of distributing the resource, maybe knowledge, maybe airtime, whatever, and it distributes it very fluently, very easily. So the cultural techne provides the frames of our fragmented, dynamic, practical orientation and enables us to engage in social life. So that these public meanings, it's kind of like language, right? Language, they're meanings. We internalize and learn those meanings. When we learn the language, then we'll be able to speak fluently. They're social meanings that have to do with what a lectern is, right? What a screen is. These are meanings, what they mean, and that we internalize in our own individual ways, responses, and we use these meanings to communicate with each other and coordinate with each other. So in ideology, as I said, I use it in the pejorative sense, is a cultural techne gone wrong. It may fail to provide the tools to appreciate the relevant parts of the world or how things are valuable, and it may organize us in unjust ways. So sometimes what happens is that the tools provide blinders so that there's some morally relevant things that we don't see. There's some scripts that we continue to enact, not realizing that there's another way to do things that we weren't aware of. Okay. What time is this over? Okay. Okay, good. Okay, a lot of time. Sorry, I lost track. Okay. So an ideology is a cultural technique on what may fail to provide us the tools to appreciate relevant parts of the world, how things are valuable, and it may organize us in unjust ways. So it may be that our techne says that women can't ask questions at public talks or public events, something like that. That would be to organize us in ways that would be unjust and would fail to allow us to produce knowledge in a good way. When we're in the grip of an ideology, our practical orientations positions us to enact, usually unknowingly and routinely, practices and structures that sustain injustice. Okay, so that's the kind of part of a social ontology that I've provided you that is going to be significant in trying to think about non-ideal theory, because what we're looking at is how it is that the structures and practices that we enact daily are enacted in spite of the fact that they may be against our best interests, that they may be totally unjust, but we can't see it, right? We don't even notice it, and we just carry on. Okay, so one step in a process of emancipation on the critical theory model is to see how the local cultural techne is ideological. The tools that we're using are problematic. They prevent us from seeing things of value or recognizing their value, organize us in bad ways. And Geuss says, at the very heart of the critical theory of society is its criticism of ideology. Their ideology is what prevents the agents in a society from correctly perceiving their true situation and real interests. If they are to free themselves from social repression, the agents must rid themselves of ideological illusion. Okay, I'll go on and then I want to say something. A critical theory challenges the understandings that motivate and appear to justify our unjust practices. And it can also offer resources to think and act differently with better epistemic and normative tools. So in the context of, speaking of ideology, there is a tradition, as I mentioned, that uses it in a general sense, a non-pejorative sense, and I'm distancing myself from that. I'm opting for the pejorative. But there's also another tradition which takes ideologies to be very explicit bases for justification of political norms and practices. So a democratic ideology. I'm not using it in that sense either. I'm using it, for those who are familiar with the critical theory tradition, in an Althusserian way. So the ideology is going to be this set of social meanings that we use to frame our practical orientations. It's oftentimes going to be completely inexplicit. It's not going to be something that we can articulate. It's going to, but it does still guide us in our responsiveness to the world. Okay, so that's where I was saying it challenges the understandings that motivate and appear to justify. So what's going to happen is sometimes when our practices are in question, then we try to justify the practice, and that will be reaching for an explicit ideology. But most of the time, explicit ideologies are not available to us. We don't even think about, we don't need them. Okay, so Geuss goes on and says, a critical theory induces self-reflection in the agents. By reflecting, they come to realize that their form of consciousness is ideologically false and that the coercion from which they suffer is self-imposed. Now notice that there's different frames, there's a whole lot I should say here, but I'm only going to just touch on it. So I think that gender is a paradigm case of ideological oppression. I think that most of us participate in our gendered social roles unthinkingly and uncritically. Even the people I know who are the most, just deepest feminists participate in a gendered division of labor, right? We just do it. We still defer. We still, stand at a certain distance or whatever. We still carry out the practices of gendered subjectivity, right? Like this. In the case of race, that's not going to be so often the case. So in the case of race, I think it's that white people in the dominant group, we're totally caught in the grip of the ideology. We enact it without thinking. But people who are in racial minority groups are much less likely to have that, much less likely to just enact it unthinkingly. And so what I want to acknowledge here is that this issue of ideological oppression or ideological domination, it affects different groups differently and different individuals within different groups differently. Okay. So to notice how the existing practices and structures depend on distorted understandings can be liberating in a sense, for we can begin to frame new intentions, explore different forms of agency, and take on new identities. So the breakdown of the gender binary, whoa, that was, it's totally radical, right? It's changing people's lives. It's making life possible for people. And this is something that can happen through, among other things, a social and political ideology critique, questioning whether the social meanings of gender are actually adequate to appreciating what's of value, adequate to organizing us in ways that are just. This enhances our autonomy, but such conceptual work or ideology critique just by itself doesn't make us free. For full emancipation requires that we also collectively change the unjust practices that structure our lives. This requires more than thinking differently. It requires material changes, legal changes, and those sorts of things. But it's important, I think, in the context of ideology critique, to see that the challenge to the social meanings, the cultural challenge, is extremely important part of the process. Okay, so that's critical theory, which is a form of ideal theory for thinking about social ontology. One of the things that it does is it situates us within a movement. It situates us in a way that we're trying to think about how the meanings have shaped our capacities for interaction and agency and the epistemology of value and things like that. And I'm trying to sketch here very briefly that what it is to have a social ontology that gives us resources for thinking about that, resources for trying to see where critique comes in and how our agency is structured by our social milieu. But I also now want to turn to this idea that what we're doing in the context of critical theory is, in the context of ideology critique, is something like amelioration. We're trying to improve the resources and the tools we have for understanding the world, particularly understanding the social world. So this section is really kind of aimed a little bit at people working on race and gender who know something about my work on race and gender. I'll go through it a little quickly for those of you who aren't familiar with that work, but hang in there, because I'll come back to the broader themes. Okay, so ideological falsehood, as I understand it, and notice that ideological illusion and ideologically false were in the Geuss references, citation, quotes. This idea, ideological falseness, is not always a failure of a sentence to express a true proposition. Ideological falseness can be true in a sense, but still problematic, for they may employ concepts that are inapt for the purposes at hand. So think about GRU if you're trying to do science. GRU is an inapt concept. It doesn't do the job. It's not doing what we need it to do. And in the context of thinking about ideological falsehoods, the same is true. You can express truths with GRU, but really, we don't want those truths. Those truths don't matter so much. So what we're trying to do is look for significant truths. Now, this is connected to some of what Miranda Fricker has called about hermeneutic injustice, but more generally, I think there's broad traditions in philosophy of science and feminist philosophy of science that are trying to sort out what makes something a significant truth as opposed to just the marker cap is green. Okay. That might be significant in some contexts, but it just isn't very significant right now. Okay. Depending on the question that you're asking. Okay. Or they may be part of a broader framework of ideas and assumptions that distort our thinking and the social reality that our thinking partly constructs. So the idea is ideological falsehoods may be problematic because the concepts are inapt, or there's this broader set of ideas and assumptions that it's really distorting our understanding of reality. Okay, working with an externalist framework, commonly shared false semantic beliefs are also a potential set of ideology, for they can mask or distort how and whether our terms track kinds, sometimes contribute to the construction of them, and enable us to avoid taking responsibility for their effects. So the point here is, you know how we can use terms but not really, know what they mean? If you're an externalist, right? Aristotle didn't know water was H2O, right? But he still used the term water to pick out H2O. And some of us have used language that we actually have false beliefs about what the referent is, but we use it nonetheless to communicate. Think about Burge arthritis. I don't know if that rings any bells to you, but the woman comes into the doctor's office and said, doctor, I have arthritis in my thigh, right? Sorry, you can't have arthritis in your thigh, right? So she used the term arthritis even though she had a very deeply confused understanding of what arthritis was. She doesn't have to have, or beech and elm, Putnam, beech and elm, okay. This is what I'm talking about here. And these kind of false semantic beliefs can go a long way in masking reality for us. And I don't think it's always accidental that we have false semantic beliefs. The word is doing its work, whether we know it or not. Okay, next page. So social constructionists, such as myself, undertaking a kind of critical theory, often appropriate the terms ordinarily used for identities and use them for the social processes and relations that make those identities available. So I have a view, for example, where to be gendered is to be viewed and treated in a certain way based on interpretations of what my body parts are and what they can do and what they can't do in a hierarchical system. So the people interpret me as being the kind of person who is capable, well, used to be capable of pregnancy, impregnation, and childbirth. And so as a result, certain kinds of social and political positions are available to me as a result. That's what it is to be gendered. And so it's not about what my body actually is, it's about the situatedness of my body in social space. Okay, so I appropriate terms used for identities like man and woman and use them for these social processes and such. The hope is that agents who come to understand the historical and political context of their identities will be taking a first step in a process of emancipation. So when I say to be white is to be positioned as a dominant person, and to be a man is to be positioned as a dominant person, and to be a woman is to be positioned as a subordinate, this is, you go, no, it's not. Anyway, and then you say, well, maybe it is. And then it's supposed to be potentially revealing of a structure that is otherwise invisible to us because we're just enacting it unthinkingly and without critique. Okay, so that's part of what social constructionists are trying to do. Some of them are trying to do. So in my earlier work, I followed the constructionist strategy to provide accounts of race, gender, woman, and man, although my view does not require that one have male genitalia to be a man or female genitalia to be a woman. It does require being subject to subordination and privilege that is linked by ideology to the local bodily markers of reproductive role. What I'm wearing is a marker of my reproductive role, right? I'm wearing certain things, and some of you are wearing other things that are markers of your gender. Who knows what genitalia you have? The whole point of clothing is that we hide it, right? And so we mark ourselves. We mark ourselves with our hairstyles and our clothing styles and such like that. And then all this stuff magically happens. The ones who are marked this way do a lot of the care work and the grunt work and the reproductive work, right? And the people who are marked in a different way, you know, this is all how it happens, right? So that's kind of my view. Not kind of my view, that is my view as of 2000, when in 2000. So this account, however, problematically excluded some women from being counted as women and some men from being counted as men. That's because some people who are marked this way are men, and some people who are marked that other way that we know, like they wear ties and stuff like that, they're women, even though on my view, they don't count as such. So this is a mistake. Some women are prevented from presenting as women, and some men are prevented from presenting as men, and so don't meet the conditions that I proposed. There are also reasons to think that emancipatory identities that do not build in hierarchy should be available to those who are gendered and raced. So Alcoff has argued that we need something like white identity that is a positive identity so that white people are willing to own it. It's very hard to get people to own, you are a horrible dominator. No, anyway. I do. That's what I am. No, anyway. Okay, sorry. No, I do. I mean, I really take that identity as who I am, and I don't like it. Oh, that guy at Rutgers, he wrote this. Anyway, he wrote this thing on his Facebook page about hating white people. He's a white person hating white people. And he's accused and actually been, charged with racism and anyway, and look it up. Look it up. I'm like, oh my God, I could have written that. Okay, but I didn't, thankfully. I don't know what MIT would do to me, but oh my God. Okay, see, this is what happens. This is why I need a handout. Because if you let me go rambling on, I just go off. It's and you know this other interesting thing? And this other interesting thing? Oh my God, go back to the handout, Sally. This is keeps me disciplined, keeps me going. Okay, and I know it's boring. I'm sorry it's boring for me to read. Oh, well, I'm trying to liven it up. See? Okay. Okay. However, My accounts do capture something about the social formation of public categories of men and women through dominant descriptions, and it's consistent with this that some men and women are excluded from these ascribed positions, and that's a problem that feminism should address. Okay, so clearly linguistic choices might be emancipatory. So I appropriated men and women and white folk and black folk for these hierarchical positions. I did that. I said, yeah, I'm taking those words and I'm using them here to try and disrupt our identities. That was the idea. I want to mess you up and get you thinking that you're not what you think you are, right? That was part of the goal, was this disruptive, critical moment of emancipation. Because emancipation, dominant people need to be emancipated too. We need to be emancipated from thinking we're the best and the most wonderful and like we can do it all, right? And that's a kind of emancipation. It's a bad thing to do injustice toward others. Anyway, see, I am like getting carried away. Okay, so I was trying to be emancipatory, but as I said, even in that paper, linguistic choices that might be emancipatory at one moment or for some individuals or in response to a certain threat may be inadequate in a broader context and even deepened forms of oppression. So it might be, as mine did, it sort of occluded a whole group of trans men and trans women whose lives were not captured adequately in my account. So that's a problem. It's true that these gestures and these emancipatory moments are very context specific, but it's something that we have to be sensitive to. There is a further lesson, however. Emancipation, I now think, involves two steps or moments. One moment is negative. We need to unmask or understand the failures of our current practices, and another moment is positive. We need to suggest better alternatives. In effect, efforts to provide tools for emancipation are not only context sensitive, but may require both a disruptive moment that targets a set of practices and a visionary moment that gives us the resources to do better. A further source of confusion in that earlier work, I think, was whether I was appropriating the terms woman and man for new or different social categories, or whether I was explicating externalist meaning of our ordinary speech. If you're not following, it's okay. You don't have to follow this. But if you're interested, keep going, okay? In the late 1990s, I was not trying to do conceptual or semantic analysis. I was doing critical social theory, and I was appropriating everyday terminology for the purposes of disrupting our identification with unjust social practices. So it was aiming for an emancipatory exposure of ideology. Later, I became more invested in revealing semantic ignorance while inviting but not providing semantic amelioration. Amelioration comes in many forms because there are multiple ways to make things better. And in the social domain, the hope is that amelioration will not only improve our understanding, but also improve the world, because our language for understanding of the world, because our language for an understanding of the world contributes to how it is. So the idea is that what we're trying to do is do a kind of semantic amelioration, and we're trying to get a greater understanding of what we're doing, because how we understand the world in the social domain affects what there is in the world, right? And that's really important. All right, so I'm going to talk through the next section. I'm not going to talk about realism. And this part is, so the last part was talking about, so let's recap. I started talking how we had to do non-ideal theory. I gave you a proposal about what kind of non-ideal theory we might embrace, and I suggested critical theory, critical social theory. And critical social theory in a social domain is one of those bottom-up theories. We're trying to learn, what the social world consists in and how we can make it better by being embedded in a social movement that is resistant to the structures that are already there. Instead of going, yes, let's take a walk together. What's happening when we take a walk together? We are forming collective intentions. And it's like, oh my God, I don't have a shared intentionality with the people who are oppressing me, right? That is really bad. And yet I am constituted through their, ascriptions of me, right? That I am a woman, or that I am white, or that I am this and whatever. So this idea that we're going to say, let's take our paradigm cases of taking a walk together and then learn about the social world through that, from my point of view, it's like, who cares about that, right? That's not interesting to me. I mean, I'm happy that other people are interested. Got you, you're good. But for me, it's like, oh my God, I am constantly constituted through practices that people impose on me that make me a subject, and make me not only a subject that is subordinated, but one that participates in her own subordination, right? Oh my God, how did you do this to me? That's what I want to know. How did you make it the case that I dominate other people in my whiteness? I don't want to do that, right? How can I avoid doing it? Those are the questions that I want answers to, right? Not about taking a walk. Taking a walk, I like taking walks. I don't like this stuff that's happening. And so what I want is a social ontology that can reveal to me how I got here, how we all got here, and how we can get out of this, right? Okay, I get excited because it matters to me. And I understand different things matter to different people. But this really matters to me. And so I got into the critical theory stuff because it seemed like, well, what we need is an account that gives us these meanings around which we coordinate, and how those pressures to coordinate in terms of those meanings are so great that I fall into them. And then what is going to happen? How is it going to be that I can break out of it, right? If those are the meanings that are available, how can I break out of it? What's going to happen? Well, I proposed that sometimes what you do is you do this kind of appropriation or amelioration of the language. And I say, hey, you think you're just a white person because you know how you look? Mm-mm. You're a white person because you have been racialized as white through a very long historical practice. Hey, you think you're a woman just means, you got ovaries? Mm-mm. That's not what being a woman is around here. Being a woman is to be subject to certain scripts and norms and standards for how to live your life, right? Okay, so what it does is it kind of dislodges certain assumptions, certain background assumptions that we have about our social categories, with the hope that you can say, whoa, I don't want to do that anymore. I really don't want to be a woman anymore. I don't want to be a white person anymore. How can I get out of it? What can I do in the social domain that will make it the case that this is disrupted, these practices are disrupted? Okay, so part of what was going on in that stuff about amelioration is giving you tools to resist the fluency that you have for participating in these problematic structures. You tools, you kind of go, you disrupt them, you kind of get people, like it doesn't matter if people say, Sally's definition of woman, so counterintuitive. And mine is, yes, exactly, that's the point, right? We're trying to make it the case that you don't just go along and go along and go along. Okay, so say a little bit about conceptual engineering then. I hope this makes sense so far. I know I'm trying to do too much. Okay, but I'm trying to talk to lots of different people, right? Lots of different constituencies. So far I've argued that there's a form of non-ideal social ontology that takes a critical perspective on understanding ourselves in society. The goal is to provide tools to challenge ideology. It does this by developing very general accounts of subjectivization, becoming a social subject, that has a place for ideological distortion. It does so by challenging the legitimacy of our particular social categories, and sometimes by proposing conceptual amelioration that can help us create new social realities. This should be informed, of course, by social theory and social activism in context. So there seem to be two levels of social ontology. The very general level that talks about how social animals are related to each other and become social individuals. That's very general. I become a social animal because I become, I coordinate with others, and I then develop a culture, and I pass that culture down to others, right? Learning happens cross-generationally or whatever. That's the very general level. But there's also a more embedded level that illuminates how it happens in particular contexts and how it might be done differently. So what is the particular culture that I have been subjectivized into, the subject that I am? How did that happen? And what am I going to do about it? Where that's quite specific. Okay. But is conceptual engineering of the sort that I've just described a form of social ontology? And is it coherent? I'm going to skip the stuff about Bachelor, I think, and the diagram on the last page. I have a theory about how this is all going to work. But let's just go to, on this view, skip the Stolniker and the Bachelor. On this view, to possess a concept is to have some, so the important crucial thing is here, we can talk about two aspects of concept. There's the content of the concept, and there's the having of the concept. I'm a Stolnikerian for our purposes here, so I just think, the content is going to be a set of possible individuals, let's say. But then there's the possession of the concept, which is an ability to distinguish what's on each side of the division. So to possess a concept is to have a cluster of capacities and mechanism for using a grid of possibilities at some level of resolution, for making the distinctions and processing and storing relevant information. So there are going to be then two kinds of amelioration. Epistemic amelioration is going to be we improve our understanding of the content of the concept. So let's look at the page, the back page. I'll do a little bit of it. 5 minutes, huh? Okay, I'll do it, 5 minutes. So the back page, figure 1. This is a quote from Seth Yalson talking about concepts and conceptual content. And he says, William III of England believed that England could avoid war with France. Did he believe that England could avoid nuclear war with France? The content of William III's concept of war might be represented as a division between war, that is land and sea, or non-war. Okay? So he had land and sea war and non-war. In the context of epistemic amelioration, which is figure 2, the space of worlds included nuclear war and cyber war. That space of worlds does include those, but William III wasn't aware of that, right? So what happens when we're doing a certain kind of epistemic amelioration is we've got this content, we've got a content. Green pen. Yes, green pen. So we've got this no war, this is war, and this is no war. And, what was it? We had land and sea. That was all that William III could do. But what we do is we improve, just like, learning of that water is H2O. And there are different kinds of water, and you didn't know all the different kinds of water. And so you just improve your understanding of what's going on in that particular area. Okay, so William III wasn't aware of that, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't use the term just as we use it. So there is this form of epistemic amelioration, and I suggest there are two kinds. Refinement, this goes back to page 3. We use concepts without having a very solid grasp of them. We may not be able to apply the concept to some possibilities. There may be gaps in our judgments about cases. So we refine our concept based on the broader or deeper knowledge of the phenomenon, by gaining empirical knowledge, undertaking conceptual genealogy, and or insight into logical space at a more fine-grained resolution. Another way to do it, this is where we're, nuclear, cyber, all of those sorts of things. But we also might do it through experiential access. We improve our access to the informational content, gaining more reliable or illuminating access by different modes of presentation. So you might say, look, those people who've never been in a war don't have the same kind of access to the information that those who have been in a war have. So their understanding of what's going on over here is improved, is richer, is more phenomenologically meaningful. So that's going to be a kind of amelioration that is ameliorating our knowledge or understanding of the content of the concept. There's also, I think, informational or semantic amelioration. We change what partition of logical space the term or concept represents. We undertake to change our thought and talk to do better in tracking reality. But better how? Okay, so we've got a world over here which we thought was in the no world space, that in fact the way we were using the term in the past was in the in the no war space. But we change how the term goes, and so what the semantic content is. So we change what partition of logical space the term or concept represents. We undertake to change our thought and talk to do better in tracking reality. But how do we do this? Alethic. We're improving the resources available to track truths, for example, race. So there are truths about race that back in the day, when people had a racialist conception of race, they couldn't talk about race as a social kind. And what they meant by race was just in this. But we now understand that there's going to be things that count as race that didn't, and that's an improvement on the concept that we had. Pragmatic, what we track with our language and our concepts can make life easier by shifting the terms of coordination. So lunch used to be a term for a meal any time of day or night, but we now use it for just midday meals, snacks, and such like that. And so this is going to be a way of improving our coordination. Or moral, what we mean can affect what we do and what there is. Semantic amelioration can be moral. So what's happening here is that it's not just that we're gaining a deeper understanding of what's in this area, but we're shifting the boundaries. Okay, so it's fairly clear how the epistemic amelioration might be undertaken, but what about semantic? If a word or concept's content is essential to it, and what else could be essential to it, then semantic amelioration would seem to be incoherent. I'm going to summarize this next section. I'm going to skip the realism section, and then I'm going to close. So my view is that this is a view about the content of concepts. We've got a partition of worlds, and we've got a fine-grained partition, and we can get increasingly fine-grained in our partition of worlds. And then the question is, but wait a minute, if this is the content of the concept of war or whatever it is, and you're shifting, then you've got a new concept, right? Because you've got a new content. And because content has to be what's essential to a concept. And in this section that I'm just skimming over, I think that's wrong. I don't think that content is always what's essential to the concept. I think what we have to see is that concepts, at least some concepts, so remember, that was not a useful picture on the board to write concepts and put a certain square around it. Duh. No, I'm not criticizing myself. I'm just trying to be funny. No, so we have, this is the content, and we have, here's us, and we have a set of dispositions to draw these distinctions, right? Those are our dispositions to draw those distinctions. And so in some cases, what's going on is that we want to say that the content of the concept is going to be whatever is going to functionally serve the purposes that we need the concept to serve as we are coordinating with each other. Okay, so marriage is the example I have in mind. I think, so, and you might think of this on Brian's view is about anchoring. So the content is different from the anchor. And the anchor is going to be in the functional role of our capacities to draw these distinctions. And so what happens in the case of marriage, the concept of marriage, the point of having a concept of marriage is to help us coordinate around sex, child rearing, financial cooperation in small groups. That's the function of the concept of marriage. And I think that what we're going to say is that the concept of marriage is going to be anchored in a Brian sense in this kind of social role, social functional coordination system. And so when we learn, oh my God, so let's change this to marriage, we learn that our previous understanding of marriage and non-marriage was unjust or dysfunctional or something like that. We change it and we start including same-sex marriages. But it's still marriage because what it's doing, the point of the concept of marriage, is to organize us around these crucial social practices and activities and needs and such like that. So we get not a new concept of marriage, but a better one. We improve our concept of marriage. We end up getting different grounds for the thing that counts as marriage for different societies. And something is going to be marriage just in case it plays that functional role in our society. Okay, so that's norms and functions. So I think that makes sense of semantic amelioration, and it also forces us to, when we do amelioration, to look again at the social ontology, the social roles, how these concepts are functioning, in the sense that how our capacity to organize ourselves in response to these social meanings, whether it works or whether it doesn't work. And when it doesn't work, we ameliorate, and that's a process of ideology critique. Okay, conclusion. So I'm hoping it's obvious that this is all realist, but we can talk about that in the discussion. Conclusion. We have an interest in carving logical space in order to coordinate with each other, to draw distinctions that serve our purposes as social beings, and to realize our values. How best to do this changes as we develop new technologies and as we come to appreciate new and different values. When social change happens, there's likely to be controversy and disagreement about how to extend the concepts we've been using to do the work we now need them to do. So in the case of marriage, there's new values, also like parent. Oh, assisted reproductive technology has really messed with that one, right? So what is a parent? So we have this new changes in technologies and new values, and there's going to be controversy, but such changes should be acknowledged as such, and we should not be held hostage to what we thought we were doing all along. So this is like saying, oh, marriage is between one man and one woman, and that's just what it is. And you need a new concept if you're going to include same-sex families. I'm going, no, you don't. What you do is you ameliorate. You see that the functional role in our organization of social life is such that it is better served by this extended content of what the term or concept of marriage is. Our conceptual framework should be forward-looking and give us the tools to envision and create better lives together. What we need now, I've talked a lot about better lives, improvement, ideology critique, and such like that. I haven't given you a normative theory about how to do that. Not going to happen now. Maybe in my book. What we need now is an account of how we know which ways are better. For this, too, we should draw on the resources of a non-ideal, critical, ameliorative, realist social ontology. Thank you. Sorry, it kind of was too much. I told you it was too much. I should have known better.
Thank you so much. So for questions, we are going to use the hand and finger method, but of course there's not enough time for fingers, so we'll just use the hand method. And please, when you ask questions, speak into the microphone so that we can get it recorded and so that everybody will be able to hear you. I'm not very good at this whole moderating thing. Moderating well is very important. There are instructions for how to moderate well in the actual sessions. So you don't use me as a paradigm for how that works. Instead, read the instructions, which actually Sally helpfully wrote. I read, but I can't internalize because I'm old. But in any case, please raise your hands and keep them high, and I will try to do it in an equitable manner. Yes. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Maybe people should say their names.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, my name is Michael Schmidt. Thank you very much for your talk. So listening to you, I couldn't help but be struck by the fact that on the one hand, you emphasize like the non-ideal nature of our social circumstance and urge us to move away from ideal theory and look into nitty-gritty and the concrete situatedness of our social lives. And on the other hand, you strongly endorse semantic externalism, which strikes me in a certain way as a kind of like top-down and ahistorical and in a way somewhat authoritarian view of meaning, which says just in view of the fact that some people have captured certain elements of reality, then it goes all the way from Lavoisier to Aristotle and determines the meaning of words. So I was wondering, can you see where I'm coming from there? Do you see that there could be any tension? Of course, that's not a contradiction because they're different fields and so on, but I sense a certain tension there, and I was wondering whether you might comment on in which way externalism is an ideal theory in a certain way, and we might want to look more concretely how people are using terms and how their usage is informed by their circumstances and their mind states rather than those than thinking of them as being ideally determined in the way that externalism does.
Okay, so I think that's really interesting. I would recommend a paper by Laura Schroeder and John Bigelow. And it's called The Classical Model of Meaning or something like that. It's a critique of the Fregean model. And they are offering a jazz model of meaning, they call it. They say in the case of the Fregean is like classical music. There's a script. The script gives you the meaning, and what ends up being the referent is what the script gives you. That's authoritarian in a certain sense, right? I mean, but in the jazz model of meaning, which is a more externalist meaning, what we're doing is we're constantly reconsidering what it is that are, taking into account lots of empirical information and different usages, the different functioning of the language for tracking certain things in the world. And so, in fact, what it's doing is picking up information from natural science. It's much more flexible in trying to allow how we come to know the meaning of a term. And so the same is true of things like marriage. It's the Fregean who says, oh, the sense of marriage is a property of one man, one woman, and things like that. But what the externalist is doing is trying to look at the empirical. This is what Putnam and all said, that the belief in analytic truths stands in the way of scientific progress. Because you say, oh, no, I'm not going to look, that's not an atom, because an atom has to be indivisible. Right? Atoms don't have to be indivisible. We know that now. So it's this refusal to accept analytic truths. It's a kind of a responsiveness to new information about the world, to new uses, that you then kind of riff on, and you develop a kind of retroactive interpretation of what we've been trying to get at all along. So what the scientist says in response to the breaking of the atom isn't, oh my God, it wasn't an atom after all, because it's now divisible, and we see that, is what they say is, no, what we're doing is taking in new information to gain better understanding of what we have been trying to talk about all along, because this is the interesting phenomenon in the world. In the social domain, I think we're doing something similar, as we're saying, and this is what I'm trying to get at, is we're saying, you know, there's a way in which we don't want to be locked into a certain rigid conception of what marriage is. We want to look at how the notion functions to organize us around childcare, around sex, around intimacy and that. And we want to say, well, does this do it well? Should we improve it? So I think externalism is by far the more consistent with kind of radical revisions of our understanding of the terms. And that's what we need if we're going to be critical. I don't think it's at all. You can be an externalist without thinking that you have, you know, scientific essentialists who are like you're deferring to all the time. And the jazz model of meaning.
Hi, thanks very much for that. Eleanor Taylor. I'm curious about how far, how open you are to doing ideal social ontology as one of the kind of other flowers that can fruit from
totally.
Well, so I wanted to ask about this by considering a very ideal abstract scenario and asking whether the scenario itself is problematic or whether the possibility of social ontology in this scenario is what's problematic. So consider a possible world in which there's just society. Now, some people would say that's not even, like all societies are at least potentially unjust, but we've got this kind of possible scenario where there's a kind of, it's reached a like just equilibrium, right? So we're not even worried about potential injustice. And there, I want to do social ontology because I'm interested in causes and reduction and stuff like that. Does that hypothetical scenario make sense? Does the practice of social ontology in such a scenario make sense? Or do you think that there's a stronger connection between social ontology and this kind of critical goal that you're describing?
Who am I to say, right? I mean, I want to say, if it works, go for it. You know, I'm not there, but that doesn't mean that you can't be there, right? I think it's a fine thing to do. Because I think that the question, going back to that, what I was saying at the beginning, I think it depends on the question that you're asking. Now, I think that social explanation, you have to I personally am interested in structural explanations and causation and these sorts of things too. And I think that it's good to have empirical information to inform us. I mean, well, obviously information informs us, to have empirical information about how societies work and how they evolve and how you can intervene in them and those sorts of things, as a matter of fact, in order to develop those theories. But I don't have any problem if you want to do it that way.
Hello. Oh, okay. Sally. Hi. Hey.
Kayvon.
Hi. I'm Kayvon. So thanks for this talk. That was great. I have a weird question, maybe. I don't know. So I'm wondering why you didn't put the word radical in the title of your talk. A lot of the things that you say are great, awesome, relevant to what we should be doing right now in the world in terms of trying to resist. And I'm wondering what kind of vision of your emancipation is part of this project, right? So one of the things that I really like about the kind of philosophy that you do and that I'm interested in is that we're somewhat attentive to what's happening in the world, and we're trying to get other philosophers to care about what's happening in the world. And when I talk to people in the world, and this might be just a criticism of non-ideal theory, what they often tell me is, look, I want to tear these structures down. I want to live in a world where people aren't racist, aren't sexist. I know that there are problematic normative assumptions underlying all this stuff. I don't need non-ideal theory to tell me that. I'm more interested in envisioning utopias and working toward those utopias. And that's really radical stuff. And I don't know where exactly it fits into the kind of non-ideal picture that we oftentimes are talking about and thinking about. So I'm just wondering whether, and this is what some Marxists call utopian theorizing, Franklin Olin Wright and these other folks. And it's the kind of thing that a lot of activists are actually engaged in. They are interested in finding ways of realizing a utopia, which is not idealist, which is not far-fetched, but it's something that just goes beyond thinking about the conditions in which we're embedded and resisting those conditions and trying to overthrow those conditions. It's the positive part of the emancipatory project that you were referring to. So I'm just wondering whether
Yeah, no, I'm anti-utopian all the way. Okay. And I'm incrementalist. I think, so I follow McKinnon on this. Yeah. She says, someone comes up to her and says, so what does the feminist utopia look like? What are we aiming for? And she said, get your foot off my neck and then maybe we can talk about it. And my view is the epistemology of utopia is very unclear, given that the forms of social life condition our capacities for thinking, beyond them. I think it's not impossible to think beyond them. I think, in fact, that's a precondition of these kinds of critique. But I think we have to be incremental. And I think that it's one step at a time. And I think that that the answer to where we should end up is going to be path dependent. So think of it this way. Jack Balkin has some nice work on this in his cultural software book, where he says, where we end up is going to depend in part about what technologies get developed in the meantime, what histories we came from, right, and what values and forms of life sort of did to us in our bodies, et cetera, along the way, and that to sort of imagine. So he uses the example, and it's not the best, but it's kind of it's fun, is he says, there couldn't, the particular aesthetic value that's embodied in rock and roll was not even conceivable until there were electric guitars, right, or something like this. So that this is a process. It's not like we have access to an end state and we're all just trying to march along to get to that end state. That's my view about this. Now, that's consistent with imagination. We need imagination. We need all kinds of imaginative sort of activities in art and literature and in politics and all those sorts of things. But I step back from the idea that what we're doing in that process of imagination is creating utopias that have any normative, pull on us.
Can everybody raise their hands one more time, just so I get a diverse group of... Okay.
Okay. Bill Ringe. So I'm struck by the way the word "we" has occurred in your talk, but also in your response first to Michael's question and then to Kayvon's question. So one question I had about it is, you used it when you were talking about the sort of pejorative notion of ideology, and you said, okay, you've got this when a social techne isn't doing what we want it to be doing, yeah? And you also said, when we were talking about meanings, okay, the meaning is what we're trying to get at. And one worry I had was that there's a kind of idealizing tendency in that use of "we," that, one way of taking that would be we, all of us, all the members of an intellectual community. And that seems as though it does the kind of idealizing you don't like. Or it could mean something much narrower. And then the question is, can you say a little bit more about what that narrower group is? Because then we have the kind of third use of the "we," get your foot off my neck, and then we can talk about it. That suggests that, actually, we shouldn't maybe talk about technes not doing the job we want them to do. They might be doing the job that some people want them to do and not others. So,
yeah, helpful. That's very helpful. So one thing to note is oh, this is not very good. I hope this is a whiteboard. Yeah, it must be. It's not just the wall. Okay. So when I'm talking about purposes, I actually mean functions. And so functions don't require intentions. So things can function in various ways, have certain functions, without it being the case that it was designed for the function. Language, nobody designs language. Nobody designs social systems. They just happen, and it's a unmitigated disaster most of the time because we have so little control over it, right? So, but still, in those systems, things have functions, and they're kinds of that we can talk about purposes relative to maintaining homeostasis in the system, right? So there's going to be a notion of function or purpose that is not about individuals. Now, one way of thinking about the we is that these systems, I think, aren't good for us. They're really bad for us, and they can do great damage to human life, the way that they run. And people try to change them, and they change this little bit over here, and then it ripples through, and it's accommodated for in various ways, right? So I think that when I'm talking about the we, sometimes I'm talking about humans who exist in these systems that are systematic, that are creating injustice, depriving us of things of value, preventing us from being what we can be, right? So there's going to be a we in whose interests we can begin to speak when we're criticizing the whole structure. Now, you might say, but there's disagreement amongst those, no doubt about it. And so my view is that I'm going to be situated in a particular place looking at particular injustices that I can see in that system, and I'm going to try to change the system because once you've gone through ideology critique, things that looked voluntary or autonomous are actually coercively imposed. And so my view is that it's wrong for a system to coerce me into doing something that I have legitimate basis for resisting. And so I can then begin to speak on behalf of the people in that position, or either myself or my allies or my loved ones or things like that. And so then the we becomes much more specific. And I think then we have social movements to disrupt the system that is coercing us to carry pregnancies to term and, et cetera. Stand up when the national anthem is being played or whatever. Those are bad systems, and we can stand in a position within that system and resist it. And that's the more narrow, get your foot off my neck kind of.
Hi, Abe Roth.
Hey, Abe.
Hi.
I knew Abe as a grad student, sorry. I shouldn't, anyway, never mind.
Long time
That's
ago.
not the good practice of answering questions.
That's okay. I was just wondering whether, at some points you talk about ideal theory and you feel, it sounded like, yeah, other people can do it. It's like, I'm not going to object if somebody wants to collect stamps and stuff like that. And, so if they want to do ideal theory, they should do it. They can do that. I'm not going to bother them. But then sometimes I feel that you actually want to be paying more attention to ideal theory, or you should care about ideal theory given what you say. Like some of the things about, well, the public school system in Boston or the educational system is just bad and wrong, right? And we should do something about it. Like we should together kind of fight this oppression. And it seems that ideal theory can contribute to saying what exactly it is that's bad about it, or why it's bad, why it's unfair.
And? Tell me. You can do it a priori.
Oh, well, I'm not a moral theorist, so I couldn't say, but I'm sure that there are lots of moral theorists who could, right? I mean,
They could?
who talk about coercion and theorize about what exactly is bad about it, right? And I feel that there is a bad kind of ideal theory which never pays any attention to what we're interested in, but surely there could be better ideal theory or better theories about shared agency who, they don't just talk about walking together, they might talk about more complicated issues, but still in kind of idealization, right? And that's the kind of ideal theory that maybe you should be more friendly to, like, relatively ideal theory. Or not. Just want to bring people together.
I actually don't think I needed a moral theory to tell me that coercion was wrong. I don't think I needed a moral theory to tell me that treating people differently based on their genitalia is wrong. Why do we need theory for that?
Well, I mean, so are you like some kind of like intuitionist about moral theory, and you just like these are kind of these rock solid intuitions that will never actually develop? I mean, because a lot of people had intuitions that slavery
where
was
are the moral theorists getting their intuitions? They're getting it from their rock solid experience too, right? So, and they go, oh, so maybe we can tweak it a little bit because we've got to get it consistent and we've got to get it, but yeah, aren't we all starting with, some very deep commitments to an understanding of very deep harms and wrongs? That's all I need. I can tell you that there's wrongs happening in this public school system without theory.
Okay, I mean, it just seems that people ought to talk about it and theorize it and think carefully about this, and that there's something to be said for that kind of collective endeavor.
I'm happy to have people talk about it, and I'm happy for them to tell me if they've got some results, right? Talk to me about it, right? But what I'm just not at all sure is if you're going to tell me, coercing people, bad.
I agree.
I'm with it. But I just don't see. I don't really see where the leverage of theory is to improve the understanding of what the people are doing on the ground to try and remedy the situation and, toward incremental betterness. And it seems to me that what will sometimes happen is that people who do the moral will suggest solutions that aren't going to make things better because the particular details of how this wrong happened matter. So if you think about bullying, this is an example I used and Elsa and I were talking about, that, bullying is wrong, but what you do in response to it depends on the particular constituency who are the bullies and who are the bullied, and what explains their bullying against this particular group, and what is the history of these two groups over time. How do we want to understand the psychological sort of trauma maybe that they've been going on? I think that you're not going to have a solution to bullying in a particular school or school system and just without all of that. And it depends, on economic conditions and racial conditions and all those sorts of things in order to have some understanding of the phenomenon that we're even trying to address. That's what I would say.
The worst part about being a moderator is having to stop discussion prematurely, but unfortunately our time is up.
Yeah, I took too long. Apologies.
But please, let's thank Sally.
Thanks.
This was wonderful.
Sorry to not so long.
Okay, So stay for one more second, and let me just tell you what's coming next. Now we are going to have a coffee break until 4 o'clock. We're going to try to keep the schedules absolutely as much on time as possible. So sessions are going to start promptly at 4 o'clock, and so please assemble in the rooms at around 3:55. After the sessions, there is a reception in the Hall of Flags downstairs starting at 6 o'clock, and that'll go till around 6:45, and then we can drift down to Breed Hall and have dinner. Tonight's is kind of an informal dinner starting around 7-ish. Okay, so for the talks that are starting at 4 o'clock, if you're presenting, and if you have a PowerPoint or other presentation, please go to the rooms during the coffee break and get everything set up. Make sure that it works so that we can start and do the transitions completely seamlessly, because there's always, you go to conferences and people lose 10 minutes doing the transitions. Don't do that. Okay, so please go to your rooms. If you're having trouble with a presentation, ask somebody in a blue shirt, okay? Right, inchoers. This reminds me, everybody's still walking around with a little sticker inside of their, even me, inside of their name tags. Take your sticker out, take it off, and put it on your water bottle. That's what it's for. And so you'll be able to keep track of your, yeah, we're very organized here. So, okay, now, in terms of the presentations, everybody's excited about that. Okay, the presentations, the rooms are in Olin, 7, 11, and 12, which is that way, like the next building up, all in the basement, all downstairs. Those are nice rooms in the basement, 7, 11, and 12. The Cabot rooms are directly below us. They are mirror images of one another, so don't get mixed up. The Muger rooms are just up, they're downstairs, and there's a hallway. And look on the floor downstairs, and you'll see signs and arrows pointing you to the rooms. Okay? Instructions from moderators will be on the podiums in all of the breakout rooms. So if you're a moderator, please look at the instructions. And also there are little signs that say 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 0 minutes. Please use those appropriately. That's it. Enjoy the coffee break. Thanks. Take it off.
Fold it in half.